Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Matt Turner. I'm the Editor-in-Chief for Business at Insider, and I'm delighted to be with you here today to moderate this panel on the deployment in the Metaverse. To quote the World Economic Forum, "The next era of the internet is fast approaching in the form of the Metaverse, an immersive, interoperable, and synchronous digital world." We're here today to talk about the industrial applications of the Metaverse, and I'm honored to be joined by an incredible array of panelists with a diverse range of perspectives on this topic. Before I introduce them, I just want to say if you're following along with the live stream, a reminder that you can use the hashtag WEF23 to comment and follow along. And for those of you in the audience, we'll have time at the end to take questions, so start thinking about those now. So we're going to talk about problems that the metaverse, industrial metaverse can solve, some of the challenges, and also use cases, which I'm really excited to talk about. So to introduce my panelists, starting from my immediate left, His Excellency Abdullah AlSwaha, the Minister of Communications and Information Technology for Saudi Arabia. To his left, Asa Tamson, SVP and Head of New Businesses at Ericsson, followed by Dr. Bernd Montag, Chief Executive Officer of Siemens Healthineers, and then on the far left, Peggy Johnson, CEO of Magic Leap. So just to share an anecdote to kick things off. So I've been here in Davos all week and telling those folks that I've been meeting with about this panel, and often the response has been, the industrial metaverse, that sounds fascinating. But what exactly is it? And so I thought it would be a great place to start. When you think of the industrial metaverse, what does it mean to you, Minister?
Thanks, Matt. And let me kick off by establishing one thing first. The current 2D world of the digital world that we live in today is not fit for purpose in the 21st century. And I'll share with you a story from neuroscience to prove it, since we have Siemens Healthcare here with us on the panel. There was a patient by the name of Elliot. He used to be a lawyer. And his doctor, Antonio Damasio, extracted a tumor from the right side of his brain. And surprisingly, post the surgery, he was not capable to make decisions anymore, because it is emotions that drive action, not logic that drives thinking. And this is why the 2D world did not work at the time of remote education, remote work, and this is why you have companies like Salesforce.com, JP Morgan calling people back into the office. Because it's not only killing productivity, I would presume it's killing the next generation leaders. We all love it in a meeting when you nudge your colleague to make sure that you tap him on the back when he's doing a great job. Or another colleague that is doing a fantastic presentation and you give her 2 thumbs up or feedback post that session. This is why genuinely I'm a big advocate of the metaverse, that it's going to be the next wave of how immersive experiences work for consumers, enterprises, and the industry.
Fascinating, and a fascinating story about the lawyer. I'm kind of curious, Peggy, as well. What do you think of when you think of the industrial metaverse? What does it mean to you, and how do you define it?
Well, I think in some sense it's already here. We're using it with our phones and our physical world. You probably got to this room today because you looked up where it was, and that's a digital merging with your physical world. I think the true potential of it is when your digital and physical worlds actually merge. And that's what the metaverse can do, when we can put digital content accurately placed within the physical constraints of your world, the world that you see. And that's when it really comes to life and brings true productivity in these industrial environments.
So let's talk about the use cases, because I think that helpful in making it real, right? So Dr. Montag, let's start with you. In terms of the healthcare industry, what are the opportunities that you see here?
So I take an example from our company. Our signature business is medical imaging. Yeah? And one way to look at imaging is it actually, instead of producing slices, yeah, so the 2D example, look at it as producing a digital copy of the patient. Yeah? And you can interact with this digital copy, so to say, in the metaverse. It's terminology we don't really use in healthcare, but it is basically where things are going. Examples, yeah? In NYU, one of our customers is using cinematic rendering. Yeah? This is something we use, so it's to illustrate disease, and instead of sending a report in text to the patient, a link to that 3D graph with text and so on and so on. We see people replacing anatomy education, yeah, instead of using human bodies, yeah, switching it to virtual exploring 3D animations. Yeah. And when you look at how care teams will be able to work remotely on a given patient, yeah, look at alternate futures depending on how you treat the patient and so on, then I think you see that in healthcare there is a lot we can do.
And Peggy, we were talking before this meeting about case studies that you have at Magic Leap as well.
Yeah, so super interesting. We've been working with a company that does heart catheterization. So ahead of a heart surgery, they have to wind a catheter through the vessels. And they were previously, a surgeon is looking at a 2D screen with some CT scan of the heart. And the patient's here, and they're making their mind sort of do the work to translate what they're seeing on the 2D screen while they're real time putting the catheter in the heart. Now they're putting the image in front of the surgeon's eyes. The heart can be in front of the surgeon's eyes. You can open it up, and because there's cameras there, you can actually see. And the accuracy of the catheterization is much higher. The outcomes are much greater. It's safer for the patient. And it's the first example of what I think will just completely change the operating theater, the surgical theater. You're going to have this additional tool in there. I think we'll look back and say, do you remember when we used to do surgery without augmentation? Because it's just a great tool for the surgeons, and the outcomes are higher.
And just to stay on healthcare for a moment, how much of this is real right now versus what you're seeing into the future? And kind of what does that journey look like?
I mean, in healthcare, things always happen gradually, yeah? And I mean, as a general statement to advertise the fields, often we hear healthcare is behind, yeah, in digital and so on and so on. And it's not because healthcare is behind, but it's more difficult, yeah? It is, you want to have ultimate safety, you want to have ultimate trust, it is sometimes harder to solve, yeah? And that is why the adoption also doesn't come in big bang. But what you talk about is also moving us, yeah. I mean, augmenting surgery with 3D and other information. It is happening, and it's the switch from 2D to 3D to 4D and real time, which is happening very gradually, but not with one singularity type event.
And if I could turn to Asa, I'm curious, just with a perspective from Ericsson, where else beyond healthcare do you see this having the greatest potential?
Well, I think we see it already now, you could say, in different maturity steps in many sectors, and I think there will be many that we have not even thought about yet. A couple of cases, we've been working with a port in Livorno, Italy. Just the fact that you can bring a digital twin real-time into operations for the head of operations of the port has reduced operations cost and efficiencies by 15%. But what I think is interesting when you look at ports is the number of CO2 emissions. And they've been able to reduce CO2 emissions by 8%. You may say 8% only, but we need every single percent if we're going to meet that goal and I think save our planet. So I think there's so many cases we start to see across industry, from healthcare, from port operations. We had an amazing case that's been in operations now for, I think, almost 2 years in Australia by a construction company. If any one of you ever done a refurbishing project of your bathroom, you can imagine, all the construction buildings, and so much inefficiency. But it's also kind of a communication problem. So once the architect, the project manager, the construction workers, the safety inspectors, the auditors, but also the users of the future building can actually not only talk about that building, it's not because they may not speak the same, what we say, typical language, but even if you all speak, say, English, you will have a different image in your brain of what that future building looked like and the details of it. And with that imaging and real-time digital twin, while they're working, they can actually start to speak, have the same vision, speak the same language, and they improved the efficiency, reduced the lead time, improved the quality. They actually have found errors, right, that they had planned thought were right, but once they saw it and can walk through it. And it's interesting, I think, Peggy, you mentioned Magic Leap has now a demo of a similar capability, right?
Yeah.
In the Belvedere Hotel here. So if you ever have some extra time, pop by. Because I think sometimes you have to almost see it, and that's what the CIO at this company said. He said, once my team put this on, they just didn't want to, they didn't want to take it off.
Right.
And this is still scratching on the surface. What I'm really excited about, if we take a bit longer perspective on use cases, is how can we bring more inclusiveness? How can you use this to onboard new employees faster, include more people in the workforce, reskill people faster, include everyone in that meeting and have the same experience, or even using that capability so you can speak the same language. We have a lot of generative AI where you can actually make now so we can have a conversation in our respective languages, and I have that experience in Swedish. And for me, you speak Swedish. I mean, it's fantastic. So many people are developing languages, but there are many that don't, and they are not included in every conversation. And I think that's really where I'm excited about what we can realize if we use this capability right.
Two follow-ups. One, just which industries are you seeing the greatest adoption and the greatest just interest in terms of the conversations you're having where people are leaning into this?
I think it's hard because at the moment there are islands, and I would say POC would be interesting to hear, I think Peggy's perspective on this as well, but I see more island. I don't see cases where this is, it was a big huge wave and everyone adopted it. But I think we see a lot of interest and immediate benefits to onboarding and skill. It's used by many automotive OEMs in production. You can bring also expertise skills to field workers. I think we're seeing it a lot in many industrial classic applications, and see most experimentation by the verticals are already quite advanced in using automation technologies like automotive OEMs, consumer electronics. The other part where I've seen quite a lot is actually huge retail and consumer goods companies that are have quite a big churn of employees and use this to improve and shorten the time for employee onboarding and training. So that's where I see most. And then I've seen a lot of exciting cases in healthcare, but I think to your point, the adoption will take some time, but quite a significant breakthrough when you think about the impact.
Yeah, just to add on to that, we're seeing a lot of activity in industrial settings, factories, and we've had companies now who are training their employees. They used to train them in a classroom with manuals, then put them out on the factory floor after a few weeks. With this type of technology, a headset on your eyes, they can bring them on board much more quickly. They reduce their training costs by 80%. PBX Linear, a small Midwestern manufacturer, has been using it. 80% reduction in training costs. But interestingly, 25% reduction in rework and scrap, which is a real savings right there. But the one that I found the most, the most promising is the engagement that the employees had. They feel more empowered. They don't have to go ask somebody because the answers they're basically wearing a PC on their eyes. The answers are in front of them. And the retention that it's caused, which is right now a huge problem in the industry. In industrial manufacturing settings are retiring. They're retiring in droves, and they can't bring enough people on. And with the low employment rates, it's a real problem. So this is a tool that can really change the dynamic in that space.
And what is so? One of the comments that I heard earlier in the week is, pilots would go into a simulator and spend hours in a simulator before they actually get into a plane and start flying and what have you. And in a way that kind of mimics some of what we're describing, right? And so the use of this in training seems very exciting. Asa, you kind of alluded to this, that sometimes there's companies have to buy in and they have to get their employees to buy in to a degree, right? I think you gave the example of once our team saw it, they didn't want to take it off, but they had to maybe be convinced to try it in the first place. Is that something that you see?
I think at the moment where I've seen that adoption, you already have, you could say, a champion who's really excited about it. I would say sometimes call it the geeky hero, right? To have a list. I think, and this is different, I think, than the discussion we had when we talked more generically about automation, where you felt a threat because you were going to be replaced. I think what we see in many of the cases with mixed reality is actually more real-time, helpful data that empowers the person doing their job. Maybe can do it safer, maybe they can do it smarter. And I think we've seen that in many cases. So I've seen less of a conflict, to be honest, in that. Then I think you have to try it on to see the power of it.
Right.
Yeah, you try and you need to experiment with it.
Yeah. Minister, you're chairman of NEOM's company focused on future technologies, including the metaverse. What is it that you see as the greatest potential, and kind of can you just take me behind the scenes a little bit behind Saudi Arabia's kind of investment in the metaverse more generally?
So let me share with you examples from Ericsson Healthcare and Magic Leap, as we have the great pleasure of collaborating with some of the biggest innovators in this space. On 5G, the Kingdom celebrates with Ericsson one of the fastest 5G deployment. And as a matter of fact, in terms of spectrum allocation, the Kingdom today ranks #1 in terms of spectrum allocated for the industrial internet, the industrial 5G, and subsequently the metaverse, which is all important about the latency that is required to enable those use cases. When it comes to NEOM, I'll share with you about NEOM and about the Red Sea project. And the chairman, the Crown Prince, he has a saying, prove it to me in a digital twin first. So prove it to me in the metaverse first. So we promised him during the Red Sea project that we're going to deliver zero waste to landfill. And he was able to show it to me on the design phase, the build phase, the optimization phase. And we were able to collaborate with those top innovators to showcase it. Within NEOM, we made a promise that we're going to preserve 95% of the environment, and we were able to do that. Let me segue into Aramco and SABIC, because they actually have the showcase here in Davos. They have a center called ICE, which is Innovation for the Circular Economy. And we were able to leverage the digital twins, the metaverses, to produce the lowest carbon intensity when it comes to our energy production, but also prevent flaring with an IoT implementation. Last but not least, with Magic Leap, we're training our folks to improve retention of these employees as they go into those energy environments and be able to deploy solar and wind in a much faster and practical way.
Fascinating. So let's talk about the impediments and the challenges, what you've described, just huge potential, but clearly, as there always are, challenges. So I'm curious as to what do you see as being the challenges to a faster adoption, essentially?
I think one is just, if you call it just the untethering. So I think we have a paradox, which is a lot of the metaverse stack is really built up by AI capabilities. And that requires a lot of power on the one hand. On the other hand, you want the devices to be as smooth, as easy to use, small, so they're easy to adopt, right? And you have a very clear conflict there. And I think this is obviously where Ericsson is trying to kind of improve the quality and capabilities of the network. But I don't think that will be enough. I think you have to couple that together with more edge compute, more edge capability, because then you can actually offset a lot of the computing from the device itself. And I think that you can architect for one factory, one site, for sure. No, actually not that complicated. However, once you want to have this across sites, across experience, across different tech stacks, providers, that's when we get into a bit more complexity. So I think be able to find a way where we can, in a more standardized way, continue to distribute workloads across different stacks, connectivity, cloud, edge, but also across provider and private and public. I think that there we still have work to do, and many actors are working on it. I think the other big one to me is bias. So we are, at the end of the day, since a big part of the stack use a lot of AI capabilities, it will never be better than the data is trained on. So I think we have a responsibility, and I think learnings from our previous work with AI, how can we make sure that we have a fully inclusive data set when we are rendering, visuals, images, faces, but also how we interpret different body language. All of that will come through as we evolve this. And I think quite often we say best effort first, and this is an afterthought. I think we have an opportunity to make sure we have a rich, more inclusive data set from the start.
Yeah, that's a great note. I would put the same question to Dr. Montag and Peggy.
So I think in healthcare, there's, when it comes to new technologies, there's always, I think, two things. One is trust. Yeah, so that, and the other one is how do physicians look at themselves? So I expand on this a bit later. Trust is, I mean, in healthcare, super important, and that is also what makes healthcare so more challenging, yeah, because there is no room for error, and there is no room for a data privacy problem, and so on, and there is no misstep allowed. I wouldn't call this an impediment. It is a necessity, but something we just have to be extremely mindful about. The other topic is whenever we augment capabilities of physicians, there is a mindset switch necessary. Yeah? So I take an example which is almost of the past. In the past, a radiologist basically took pride. I am good at looking at 2D slices, and I can reconstruct in my mind what the disease is. I see internally, so to say, the 3D, this is a tumor. When you suddenly see a 3D tumor, it is almost like an attack on who you believe you are. Yeah? But what is necessary is that you then say, wow, you know, this step became mundane, now I can work on the next problem. Yeah? And I think this is super important, that how do we say, hey, I'm not a pattern recognition machine. Yeah? I am here to bring innovations to healthcare. I am the communicator in a care team. Yeah? I'm the editor of the diagnostic information. It's a different way to look at yourself. Yeah? And I think this needs to have, we need care, yeah? And take this very serious, yeah? Because especially in healthcare, what people have learned defines them as persons. Yeah, it's not like in any other job you can change. Yeah, in healthcare you are a cardiologist and you stay a cardiologist. You cannot say, hey, next thing is I do anesthesia. Yeah? So we take away something from them, and we need to make sure that there's no barrier. Yeah?
Can you just describe how you're tackling some of those challenges? I want to move to Peggy in a moment, but I find that fascinating.
It's in the end, I mean, when you look at adoption curves in our industry, I mean, and it sounds a little bit like textbook, yeah, but you need to work with the early adopters. Yeah, you need to work with the guys in this mini community of a medical specialty, who are the front runners, and then people see, wow, this guy is doing this, yeah, or this lady is doing this, yeah, and it's somebody who is like me, and I can see this is not replacing me as a physician. This makes me a better physician, and the future is a physician who's using this, and I want to be part of it. It's not a threat. I want to shape this. Yeah, and I think it's really about selecting the right showcases. Yeah, so our neoms, so to say. Yeah.
Fascinating.
That's interesting, because we were talking about this on a panel yesterday, this kind of generational gap. You're comfortable using something in a certain way, and now you've got a new tool that could possibly give more value, but there's a bit of an obstacle there to adoption. And we have seen that. We learned a lot from going from our first device to our second device, just about the usability. People have to pick it up over whatever they used to be doing, and if you can't solve that for them, you know, the technology is just going to sit on a shelf. So the product itself has to be small and light. It can't bother your nose and your head. It can't be hot and heavy. It's got to be able to be comfortable and provide value for someone to choose it over whatever they were doing, looking at a 2D screen or a manual or something like that. So we spent a lot of time on the human factors around it, to make it comfortable, so people will choose that over, you know, the old habit that they had. But it's definitely a problem. That, you know, new technology, you need to find the early adopters, and we've gone to industries who already are wearing something on their eyes, so defense, public sector, healthcare. Many times surgeons are wearing magnifiers and things. In industrial settings, they're wearing safety goggles. So they're comfortable with it, and that's why that was the first entry point that we focused on.
Fascinating. How are you tackling this? It sounds like the Crown Prince is an early adopter, one of the folks that we've been talking about.
Big time.
Yes, but beyond that, how are you tackling what's been described in terms of getting people comfortable with using this, changing their habits somewhat?
I completely agree with what was shared. It's about the bias, it's about the interoperability, and it's about making sure that we don't have any red taping or red flagging. Let's talk about the bias. Today, if you just search on your typical search engine, beautiful hair and not so beautiful hair, you'll find two ethnic groups, and that's completely not acceptable. We're all excited about open AI and ChatGPT. There's a new tool called DALL-E 2, which is all about text to imagery. And again, bias, if you say beautiful eye, it will show you one shade of color. Let me give you a hint, it's not right. Secondly, when you're talking about red flagging and red taping, and I want to acknowledge here on the stage, Microsoft, they did the right thing. But they did it on their own, and that's why we need a collective effort. And I remember you spoke about His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. We were very fortunate during the G20 2020, the toughest year that humanity have seen under his leadership, to drive consensus on the OECD principles for trustworthy AI, how it should be robust, inclusive, human-centered, with security, with accountability. So this is one clear example of Microsoft taking accountability for Minecraft when they stopped their blockchain engine because it was driving the wrong behavior. Last but not least, you talk about interoperability. The theme this year at WEF is a new system for cooperation and collaboration in this fragmented world. We have so much polarization in the analog world. Let's make sure that we don't have it in the digital world, and definitely not in the metaverse.
So just to build on that then, you have a great perspective, having been in the private sector now in government. What part does cooperation between public and private, between regulatory bodies, between the education system, what does that look like? What does it have to look like, do you think?
The most beautiful thing that I have seen is drawing parallels from success stories that we've had in fintech, in green tech, and those successful stories. It started with one principle: innovate then regulate. Sandboxes. We need right now, and we're very happy and fortunate that we have launched a number of sandboxes with Aramco, with SABIC, and it's showcased today at WEF, and with NEOM, in how we're bringing academia, innovators, policymakers, and regulators into one sandbox to make sure that it's a safe environment for us to innovate in healthcare, with Ericsson and with Magic Leap. So that's the first principle. Secondly, let's start with guiding principles. This is a low regulatory environment to begin with, but let's make sure that we have some guiding principle on at least what is right and what is wrong. Let's move a little bit from the red taping to red carpet when it comes to the metaverse. And last but not least is success breeds success. As we celebrate what we have done with Aramco in their training and their retention, with SABIC and how we have simulated wind turbines and PV solar panels with better efficiency, and with NEOM and Red Sea projects preserving the environment and safeguarding the planet. So it's moving from those pilots to prototypes to success and scaling them up.
I saw your fellow panelists nodding along there, so I'd love to turn to them as well on this, in terms of the role of cooperation between government and private sector and beyond.
I think there are a number of different dimensions that I think that collaboration needs to happen. I think, first of all, just coming to the basic capability of connectivity that will be needed in most of these cases, we still have very different starting points for just getting the right license to spectrum to even make this opportunities, capabilities available to all people around the world. And even in Europe, we're struggling big time to catch up. I think there are many leading countries that have been faster in adopting that across the world. So I think that's just one fundamental. How do you make sure they put the right regulations, policies in place, so the foundational technology is actually there, accessible for all countries, all people be included in that, because it's a sandbox of innovation, but frankly also even be part and learn the skills, so you can also be part and relevant when jobs are created and companies are growing or created based on these capabilities. The other part, I think, is really about your point about sandboxing. Sometimes, there are important things, some that we raise, bias, some privacy, security, and sometimes we have a tendency that we want to over-regulate everything because we just don't want to see any mistakes. And I think here comes the paradox. Yes, we need to design the platform and solutions to address these concerns. But if we don't experiment, if we don't learn, if we don't do that sandboxing, then we will frankly not get anywhere, right? And I think here we can learn a lot, both from NEO, but frankly also from the US, that I think has been very successful of not putting too much regulation early, which is why you see much more VC investments, much more capital going into this early stage of innovation, but also much more startups, right? And then once it becomes big and proven, well, then you start with the regulatory actions, right? Then you actually have something to regulate. With that said, I think we can still learn when it comes to biosecurity and think about that design and make that part of the innovation.
What does this look like for you, Dr. Montag?
See, maybe a little bit of a different angle, yeah, because I was yesterday in a session, the quantum tipping point, and then relatively at half of the session or so, there was suddenly the discussion: how do we make sure the global South benefits from this technology? Yeah? So it came as an awkward but extremely important comment. Yeah, I found. So one different question is, yeah, when we say in the metaverse, do we want to do the typical stuff? Yeah, we start with the people who have everything already, and then comes the next challenge: how do we make it accessible for 8 billion? Yeah, and I believe in again in healthcare, there's always two vectors of development. One is how do you improve what is already out there, and the other thing, how do you make things accessible where it's not yet? Yeah, and I think one important topic, and this is maybe where governments in our space could play also a role, is how can we use these technologies to leapfrog certain developments in the global south, yeah, where you don't have to break a bias of an existing system, but there is no existing system, and you jump to the target state right away. I mean, like the famous mobile phone example. Yeah, and I think this is something we should put on the map, and I haven't really sorted it out yet. But I think it's for me, I think it's an important thought, and this thought yesterday really was eye-opening for me.
Yeah, an incredibly important point. Go ahead.
So I think whenever you're launching new technologies, and hopefully we've learned from past launches, is you really need to work with government early and often so they understand what these technologies can do, the extent of the impact they can have. And that's actually something I learned at Microsoft. I think they do that a very nice job of that. And as we began to launch augmented reality, you have to remember these devices are not a cell phone. They are brimming with sensors. There's 5 cameras looking at your eyes because we need to know where your eye is gazing so we can put the digital content there. There's 4 cameras looking out at the world, mapping the world constantly so we can succinctly and accurately place that content. So these are not, your grandfather's cell phone. These are something completely different. And we've been engaged with the government since the start so they can understand, so that they don't overregulate, but they also don't underregulate. Yeah. And I think that's the appropriate way to bring new technologies in. You don't want to suppress innovation, but you also don't want to allow some of this out in the wild without the proper constraints around it.
I want to ask 2 more questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. First off, just around skills. So we've talked about how the industrial metaverse can be used to train up people in different professions. But what does the skills, is there a skills shortage in terms of people to build and maintain these applications, right? Like is there enough tech talent right now? What needs to be done in that space?
Well, I mean, we draw from the gaming community often because gamers are building 3D images if you've ever played any games. And so that is a base skill that is required. Developers who can code in platforms like Unity and Unreal and those physics engines. Those are things, and I think there's probably not yet enough emphasis on that from graduating students. So that's something we have to shift a little bit so that we have more skills to build these very useful applications.
I would be interested to hear from.
I'm actually, of course, one always has to say we don't get enough people and so on and so on. Yeah, but actually, I'm pretty happy with where we are, and I think what the difference is, it is the purpose, and is for the generation which is most active in this. It really makes a difference. Yeah, and gaming is maybe nice, or optimizing search engines and so on. Yeah, but having an impact. Yeah. On global healthcare, yeah, and especially when it's so visible, yeah, so immersive, like working on this, yeah, is a super attractive field, yeah. So and that really helps us also. Yeah.
Interesting. Minister, I'd be interested to get your perspective. You work with Magic Leap with Microsoft, but what does it look like for you in this sense?
I think this is a global headwind. I mean, WEF says that there's 4 million cybersecurity professionals that we need yesterday and 4 million coders. But I think we were able to shift that headwind to a tailwind in partnership with you and with you. So the kingdom in the past 5 years, we've jumped as a tech force from 150,000 tech force to 340,000. Just to put this in context, the Silicon Valley has 384,000, but they achieved that in 50 years. So that shows you the rate of speed and change that is happening in collaboration with you. But what's more importantly is the women inclusion story. And I would argue that this is the most audacious women empowerment and inclusion story in the 21st century. We have jumped from 7% women empowerment in tech and STEM to 32%, surpassing the EU average, G20 average, and even the Silicon Valley average. And it's not a surprise that in terms of women founders, the kingdom today globally ranks #1. So we're doubling down on talent and technology in the industrial metaverse.
Just very quickly, how on earth do you do that? It's a remarkable achievement, but I'm curious.
5 years ago, the journey started with Prince Mohammed bin Salman MISC Foundation, in which they have ramped up what we call the Million Lives program, in which we have touched 1 million women and youth, not only in the kingdom, but in the region. And we started with Microsoft. Peggy at that time was at Microsoft. We started right now with Magic Leap and with Siemens and with Ericsson. And that created a movement and a momentum, and a tipping point happened. And this WEF we announced with IBM, with Coursera, reskilling and upskilling, with IBM 100,000 folks, and with Coursera 250,000 folks. And we intend, under a new organization that we recently announced called the Digital Cooperation Organization, to open up that toolbox to more than 30 nations to be able to create one of the largest upskilling and reskilling movement in the digital economy.
Wow. Last question before we turn to the audience. And I know this is probably impossible to answer, but I'm just curious about expectations on time frame. Like, what are we, in 5 years' time, how prevalent will this technology be? What we'll be looking at, just across each of your perspectives? So let's start with Peggy.
Well, a lot of times I'm asked about consumer. Actually, our company started with a focus on consumer, and it was not quite the right time. Like many technologies, the products there, the timing isn't quite right. But I think in order to really get to a consumer tool that everyone can use, it's going to take some time. It's going to take a few years, maybe as much as 5 years. The silicon has to integrate further, much like a mobile phone did. It was big and then it was small. The components have to reduce. The batteries have to get much, much smaller. So there's going to be a trajectory very similar to mobile phones we'll see in this space until we can get to consumer. I do think we'll be at consumer about 4 or 5 years out.
And then, Asa, I'm kind of curious your perspective on this.
I think it's also defined, we have to start a definition. What does it mean, adoption? I think when you think about having a fully ubiquitous metaverse across us, I don't know, will we ever get there? I'm not sure. But I do think we'll start to see adoption of capabilities that are part of this mixed reality, and also a lot of the generative AI that goes into it. I think we can see fully mixed and immersive experience in islands and locations. So that's what I expect. But just to put some perspective, I mean, when we started, if we think about apps you have today, and you get an SMS notification, that is built on a standardization of a global API for SMS. That took 20 years. 20 years to get there into one global standard. It's not, we had a mobile standard, right? But I'm also very encouraged. I think we will go faster, but I don't think it will take, I don't think it will take 2 years. If we look at when South Korea started rolling out 5G, it's the fastest adoption of any technology we've seen so far in a country. So the speed is increasing. It has increased a lot. But I'm also very humble in terms of both on the device side, frankly, the network and computing side, and how to manage those workloads, as well as actually build a whole ecosystem that will innovate and create those meaningful applications so it gets used. And even if when we get there will also being about adopting, getting that doctor to really use that capability. So I don't know. I think it will take time until you see the full spread adoption, but it's also clear that people now want to experiment it. I heard a survey, I think Accenture did, 55% of 9,000 survey consumers wanted to be part of the metaverse and start using an application this year. I think if you hear from industrial leaders, you heard 70% are looking that they want to start using and piloting, if they're not already, meta-capable applications. So I think we'll see different journeys, and then we may see kind of sandboxes where that adoption is going faster, and we can see what is possible.
And Dr. Montag, what does the hospital of the future look like? 5 years' time, let's say. How prevalent will this technology be in medicine and healthcare?
I mean, one discussion is, will there be a hospital, yeah? And I mean, it's a bit of a provocative statement, but to some extent, the hospital is defined as the patient needs to go somewhere to get the treatment because there are the specialists who do the stuff, yeah? So the question is, what do the technologies we talk about mean for this? Yeah, can you get surgery from somebody? I mean, not at home, okay, yeah, but who is not at exactly this hospital, or can emergency cases be treated like this? And I think this will start. There will be centers in the time frame you mentioned where this becomes routine. Yeah. And I think otherwise it is use case by use case. We will have universities where medical education is completely done virtually instead of cutting human bodies. Yeah? And we will have care teams working virtually on, or working in the medical metaverse, if you wish, yeah, on cases, because the topic of collaboration, yeah, is super essential in medicine. Yeah? So there's an entity called the tumor board. Yeah? There's where all the people, the surgeon, the radiologist, and so on, come together to decide what is happening, what should we do with this patient. Yeah? So the multidisciplinary nature is extremely important in medicine. Yeah? But that is also a big opportunity for metaverse type applications. How do you bring these people together without having necessarily to be in the same hospital? Yeah?
It's fascinating. I want to give the audience, we have a sizable audience here, an opportunity to ask questions. I think, do we have microphones, or do we just go ahead? Yes, I think here in the front.
I'm David Kim from Korea. I am the chairman of Dason Group, which is one of the largest natural gas company in the country. So based on the constant cash flow from the natural gas, I've decided to go into the private equity. And so far it was successful. And recently I earmarked about $10 million for investment in the metaverse. But for myself, I'm confused because it all sounds like AI, AR, VR, all computer graphics, the same thing. So my question for the panel is, what is so unique and different is the metaverse compared to the predecessors like all the digital things?
Great question. I'll start with Peggy, I think.
Wow. I think what's different, it's a different medium. And it's something that, we haven't had the opportunity to engage in much because we haven't had the devices out there. But it's a completely different medium. You can put 3D images in front of your eyes. Eventually we'll be able to have, depict people, not just avatars, people who will be anywhere in the world in front of our eyes. And I think we're still learning about all the opportunities ahead. I liken it very much to the mobile phone. When it first came out, everyone thought, wow, you can make a phone call from your car. Isn't that great? You don't have to stop, find a phone booth and park and all that. That was what a mobile phone was. I was there. It was back at the Qualcomm days. This technology is very similar. What we're talking about today is what you can do with it today. There's very useful use cases today, but in the future, I think it's sort of the sky's the limit. It is the next paradigm in computing, and I would not bet against it.
I think just to build on that, I think perhaps part, and decipher maybe some of the confusion is what you're describing, Peggy, is kind of, it's a blending of worlds, right? And blending of, and that whole experience, what we call the metaverse, where we blend the physical and digital world. But what we can do with it, actually we're using so many capabilities. And that's why you will hear about computing. That's why you will hear about XR, VR, AR. That's why you will hear about all the AI capabilities, because you're using those capabilities when you're creating the experience or applications that you want to use in what we call the collective kind of concept, the metaverse.
Are there any, just a question for me, a follow-up question, are there any, where would you recommend we go here in Davos, or there on the promenade or elsewhere where you can actually try this on or use it? Is there anywhere that we can?
Yes. We have a small booth in the first floor of the Belvedere, room 140, if you want to come by. I know there's also Accenture has several devices. I'm sure Meta is showing their devices.
I believe
Microsoft
WEF
has
as well
global
has
collaboration village with the WEF. So there are a lot of opportunities at the conference this year.
Fantastic. Any other questions from the audience? I have one more, but just looking for hands. The one question I was going to ask, sorry if I missed any hands, what we haven't talked about is kind of the commercial opportunity here and kind of sizing that. Like how you know, we've talked about productivity gains in terms of sustainability gains as well, in terms of cutting out the unnecessary use of resources, in terms of training employees. Like how big of a business opportunity is this ultimately? How big does this market grow to?
I mean, I can quote a number. IDC has a number of 140 billion over, say, the next 5 years of everything. That's AR, VR, consumer, and enterprise. Having said that, the fastest growing line in there is enterprise AR, because it actually has use cases that have ROI right now.
And for example, in the medical market, do you have a sense of?
Yeah, in our case, yeah, it's like, I mean, imagine 50 years ago, somebody, what is the market for computers in healthcare? Yeah, and I think, yeah, and there's also the debate, what is the potential of AI in healthcare and so on. And I think, and also to your point, at least in our industry, quote unquote, we shouldn't put this as a separate market. It needs to be completely integrated. And the more we have the feeling we need to charge extra money for it, the more we are maybe on the wrong track. Yeah? It needs to be an integral part of how healthcare is delivered and make it more efficient. Yeah? So from that point of view, it is just one of the many wonderful innovation opportunities in healthcare, and we will make some money for you. Yeah.
I echo that, and I actually refrain from making big, predictions of how big the market will be, because I think we're still learning, and I fully agree that it will not be one independent market. It's so many interrelated capabilities. But what I think is an interesting point also, if you look at today we have, I think, 3 billion people around the world who are not connected, who doesn't have the basic connectivity, right? And we've seen just by connecting those people, we will actually contribute to GDP growth. We will contribute economic health, education, inclusion. So I think also in the context of being at the World Economic Forum, I think, of course, it's the big business potential. And I think once you get it right, the adoption, because there is tremendous value, we've seen that it will be big. But I think also from a bigger, from the macroeconomic side and also from health and inclusion, I think about if we can also do that leapfrog. First connect, give that basic need of connectivity, which can enable education and health for many people who don't have access to it today. But what if you could also get that leap, make that leap so you can actually get access to the medical expertise, although it doesn't exist in your country. Yeah. And you can actually start to completely redesign how you get access to good quality healthcare, regardless of where you live, and also same thing with education. I think that will be quite interesting. Will there be hospitals? Will there be just one physical institution called Harvard or Stanford? Or how will that look like when you start to look at both education, health for the masses, but also the quality and specialist education and healthcare?
That's a great note to close on. I'm conscious of time. This has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you all for attending. We've heard about the real-world case studies, the challenges, and also the importance of cooperation. I want to thank our panelists for joining us. I want to thank our audience as well, and of course the World Economic Forum for putting this event on. Thank you for attending, and goodbye. Thank you.